I'm very grateful to Dr. Tai Neilson for agreeing to be the first speaker, for being prepared to talk so early in the semester, and also for his help in getting today's seminar on. I've had a number of questions about promotion, about Zoom links, about calendar invitations and so forth. Tai had very kindly, when he first heard about this idea, offered to. So he really has. So I'm grateful to him for that. So to let you know, I will hand over to the chair, Dr. Margie Borschke, in a moment. I'll come back a couple of minutes before 5. Alert you to what the next seminar is. You're welcome to, of course, be part of that. But if you would like to stay on, pour yourself a glass of wine, and I will show you the covers of the 8 books that we are going to be hearing about through this year. So there is the opportunity to stay on for a quarantine either this evening and to host Tai on his first book and others in the department for their research achievements. Okay, I will at this point hand over to Dr. Margie Borschke, who is a senior lecturer in media and has kindly agreed to chair this first seminar.
Thanks very much, Bridget. Tai and I have decided that we're going to have a conversation about his book rather than have him give a presentation and then all of us grill him. We'll still grill him, but in a good-natured way. So we're going to start off. I spent a very enjoyable morning reading Tai's book, Journalism and Digital Labor, Experiences of Online News Production. And it was a really interesting book for me as a former journalist and as a journalism educator, but also as a scholar of media technologies, because Tai brings so many of these things together in this book. And it's a really exciting book. And it's a cultural and social approach to thinking about journalism as labor, as digital labor in particular, and the changes that are afoot. Okay, so Tai, I'm going to hand over to you right away. Can you tell us about the core argument in this book?
Thanks, Margie. There's a primary argument in the book that I make is that journalists really now work for what I call two masters. And so, of course, they work for news outlet, the news company that they might be a salaried worker for, or if they're freelancers, that they produce pieces or buy the word for that news outlet. But they also work for digital platforms, for social media sites, and for companies like Google, when they do things like promote themselves, their work, their news organization in social media, or when they do digital specific work like making metadata tags or optimizing their stories for search engines. So in some ways, while this isn't built into the names of the chapters, the book is kind of organized along these two lines, these interrelated work relationships or labor relationships that journalists enter into. So kind of the first half of the book deals with some of the changes and some of the issues that journalists face with the increasing intensification, kind of like the speeding up of the news cycle, as well as the extension of their work beyond what were the traditional understandings of what reporting meant. Then we kind of get into the ways that journalists work for social media. So in those cases, like in some respects, what journalists do in social media is very similar to what you and I do. We curate a version of ourselves, the type of ideal identity. We post content, we engage with one another and maintain effective networks with people that we know on those sites. So in many respects, it's quite a familiar set of tasks or responsibilities that many of us just do in our free time. But what kind of differentiates what journalists do when they work for social media companies is that they are, through implicit or explicit ways, really required to work in these companies to produce content, to curate their profiles and so forth in social media. In some instances, it's individual journalists doing this on a reasonably ad hoc basis. I mean, they get journalists a role in training and really think through what their social media profiles are going to look like, how they're going to mix their personal interests with their professional work. But they still do it on kind of an individual basis. But increasingly, news companies are also producing more institutionalized roles that are, in some cases, entirely dedicated to keeping people engaged on social media so that they can get click-throughs and so that they can get subscriptions or memberships as well. So that's the realm of like the social media editor, a new set of a new role in news organizations over the past decade that really intermixes the skills of more traditional reporting and journalism with many of the skills that would be more associated with PR or marketing as well.
And Tai, one of the things that you bring up in the book that I think is really interesting is about these social media editors. Because on the one hand, it's exciting, though, these new jobs within journalism, like at a traditional news company. But one of the things that you write about that's really quite fascinating is how the role that they play in shaping the kind of professional ethos in the newsroom, in shaping expectations of how much can be done, what can be done, but also how these roles end up shaping the stories that journalists tell and how they tell them. Do you want to speak a little bit about that, sort of bring out some of that detail? Because you spoke to how many? About 40 journalists.
Yeah,
over at two different times. Is that right?
Yeah. So it ended up at 47 journalists.
47, right.
But yeah, so the majority of those were in about 2016, and then we went back and spoke to 11 people who were in social media editor roles. And there's kind of a bunch of roles that orbit around that, so like audience editors and so forth as well. Yeah, so how are they changing news practice? I think an important way to see these new roles is that they're like change agents. Right? They're people who are respected in news organizations because most of them have come up through more traditional reporting roles and then have moved into these new positions. So their colleagues don't see them as outsiders who are coming in to impose some new type of regime on them, but rather as valued colleagues who are starting to shift expectations in the newsroom about how journalists operate. But one of the things that I kept hearing from the journalists that I spoke to was that they'd changed their work process to make sure that they thought about social media not just after they had done the research and reporting, but from the very beginning. So from the outset, thinking about a story, they would think, what communities is this going to reach? How do we frame this in a way that it's going to get some traction on social media? And then this type of thinking would inflect the research process, the writing, and then of course the way that they circulated the piece in the end as well. And finally, I kept hearing this over and over again, that journalists would say, you have to think about it as not more work. It's just something that you do. But of course it is, right? It's they could have listed out, now kind of 6 different discrete processes that they went through when they were producing the news. But I think even qualitatively, it's shifting the ways that journalists write. I mean, look at a news story now compared to how it looked in a newspaper, and you're going to see immediately all of these differences, like the bullet point kind of main ideas at the top and subheadings and that kind of thing, which are really formal changes. But I think there's this kind of dialectical relationship between news and journalism, between news and social media, where those ideas around being kind of authentic, about presenting a version of self, also seep into news writing. So one journalist who I talked to gave me this example where she said that she had very strong views on women's rights and abortion, and she'd written a piece on the topic. And in a very traditional journalistic sense, she had tried to write this very objectively. She had tried to remove herself, her own views and her own experiences from the piece, and to create a very balanced news article. She was then confronted by some of the people who knew her through social media or who knew her, more generally in life, who said, "I didn't realize you had those views, that you," thinking that she actually kind of supported a perspective which was antithetical to her own beliefs. And so this caused a lot of reflection on her part. And she thought, when she was talking to me, she said she was still working through these ideas, but perhaps it's more honest to try and be authentic and to allow more of the self into the types of news that you produce than trying to reproduce a more traditional understanding of neutral or objective news. So I think even the kind of it's causing a cultural shift that, I mean, in some ways that's being adopted and brought in by those specific social media editor roles, but it's also just happens through the types of interactions that individual journalists have as well.
Mm-hmm. Another story, I think we really should come back to this kind of construction of authenticity that is required of journalists. But I want to kind of stay with where we were first around this kind of the social media editors as change agents, and also the way these practices change the actual journalism itself. And one story that you recounted, a journalist talked about, how they were exposing their reporting process before they could really verify things, right? And that this was this sort of fed the that kind of desire we have when there's some kind of live news event. You actually talked about your own experience of following a news event, that we just want more, and we just keep refreshing our feed and we keep looking at it. So it's kind of like showing the reporting process through Twitter or something. How do journalists feel about this kind of new what do we want to call it? I mean, it makes journalists anxious to not check some of these things, right? So how do they feel about some of these new ways of revealing what they do while they do it?
Right, yeah, I think I had a journalist put it in this really pithy way. And it's great interviewing journalists because they're great sort of storytellers. But one said that we're no longer reporters, we're updaters.
That's the story I was thinking about, yeah.
So in this case, she was thinking of, she kind of recounted the idea that she was a very local reporter working for a small news company. And in the past, she says she would, go out to something like a traffic incident, and she would interview 3 or 4 people. She would go back to the office. There would probably be a photojournalist there as well. She would make a few phone calls. She would craft a piece, and then it would go out the next day. But now the process is much more. The first piece of information you get, it goes online, and then you slowly update aspects of it as you gather more information. If you have the time to gather more information, because there's that time pressure to produce multiple stories as well, and that can obviously that has big ramifications for verification, for potentially sharing incorrect information. And if a reader sees the story in an early stage, and doesn't see the updates or the corrections later on, then that could mean that they're getting incorrect information. It's not all bad though, because there are also new ways that kind of, I mean, transparency seems like a very kind of neoliberal term, so but I'll use it anyway. That kind of transparency and that kind of collective verification as well is useful. So if a journalist posts something, they often have probably too many sets of eyes that are already looking it up and critiquing it and giving any corrections on it as well. So there's this more collective process that can take place in social media of verifying news stories as well.
Mm. Yeah. Now, so we're sort of starting to talk about some of the potential problems. One of the key problems that your book is interested in is the precarity that journalists not only now face, but this is actually a really long a problem with a long history. But the precarity and anxiety. Can you speak a little bit about what started this book? I mean, it started as your PhD, but what were the problems that you were really interested in addressing with this research, talking to so many journalists in both New Zealand and the U.S.?
Yeah. So this is probably a 10-year project. I mean, I started to research and write the book about 2015, but the impetus for the book was probably around 2011. So I was in New York at the time, and I was working for a media research firm while I was at the New School for Social Research, and I got kind of as a New Zealander from a reasonably small city, from a reasonably working class background in politics, I was kind of thrown into this weird milieu of some of the new media capitalists, we'll call them. So like the founders of like BuzzFeed and the Huffington Post were kind of in the same circle as my boss at the time. And tell you, it actually felt a little bit gross to me. It's a bit weird, but this new kind of group of media capitalists who were creating a new business model where they were relying on user-generated content to fill their sites that were becoming incredibly profitable. And so in 2011, the Huffington Post was sold to a kind of old new media firms at AOL for $11 billion. And there was a strike by the contributors to Huffington Post. So these were writers who weren't paid, many of whom were actually like professional writers. So they were producing content for the site, but doing so only for exposure. And they decided to go on strike. And the News Guild came along with them and helped them make this strike into something that was big and newsworthy. And so at that point, it really brought into relief not just that these new platform companies were using user-generated content, but that some of that content was being produced by professionals who had trained and who had developed skills to be able to do this over a long period of time. So I thought that concern wasn't really reflected in a lot of the writing on, say, free labor at the time or on digital labor, and I thought that was an intervention that I wanted to make. So since then, I think since 2015, there's been more than 60 like digital news companies in the US who have unionized. So I think that first strike really brought some of those concerns into relief. And then over the past decade, issues related to digital labor have become increasingly salient, to the point where perhaps the term digital labor almost becomes too commonplace, and it almost kind of eliminates itself. But hopefully, it's still relevant enough to have it in the title of the book. And
so that was the kind of setting you were in. we can tell there's some personal reasons why you might have chosen New Zealand and the U.S. But what's the advantage of this case study, this comparative case study between journalists in two very different countries and very different journalistic ecosystems? Tell us a little bit about that.
So they're both predominantly English-speaking media markets, and they have some similarities in terms of their commercial aspects of the news ecology in each country, but they obviously give us a lot of differences that we can start to probe as well. So the big one is the size, obviously. New Zealand's population and also the media market is just so much smaller, but also the mixes of public, commercial, and non-for-profit news allowed me to kind of address some of the different economic but also cultural aspects of those two case studies as well. So New Zealand has a large role for public broadcasters, and I think that TVNZ and Radio New Zealand, which are I think soon to merge, have a kind of structuring effect on news media in New Zealand. As public broadcasters, they serve as kind of an archive for the news culture and also a training ground for newer journalists coming through as well. And other than that, in New Zealand, you've got 4 large media companies that dominate New Zealand media. In the US, you've got a much larger dominance of commercial media, and so that includes the big corporate kind of syndicated news. Big examples of that would be Sinclair, who has this voracious appetite for buying up local broadcasters, and they've been in the news recently because of their very conservative editorial line and for requiring some pretty dodgy pieces to be aired by their local syndicates. And then the other one is Gannett. I think most of us probably know it as Gannett, but they have just been buying up newspapers across the country. I actually got the chance to go to Gannett's headquarters. I interviewed kind of one of the higher up editors there, and he walked me through the newsroom and he showed me this huge map on one of the walls that was dotted of the US that was dotted with pins. And he said, we now have news outlets in, I think it was 43 states at the time, but watch the space, we're growing. And so he worked for USA Today, which was their big flagship, but you could see the dominance of these big corporates. That are also downsizing the newsrooms that they buy up as well. But in the US, there's also a smaller non-profit sector, which is run by a lot of journalists who are really passionate about producing news for communities and about stories that just don't make it into commercial news media. And it's also incentivized by basically tax incentives in the US that make it a good thing to do to fund these kinds of organizations. And this really, I guess the kind of findings of that is that this in some ways shapes the type of imaginary that we have about what the future of journalism can be. In New Zealand, everybody said, Radio New Zealand is great, we need more of that. So public broadcasting becomes the kind of the hope or the goal for the future of reporting, whereas in the US, a lot of those hopes resided on that very small non-profit news market, as well as those differences between the two case studies. There are broader global shifts in technology and economics, and also in culture more widely, a kind of globalizing culture that is inflected in these national contexts as well.
Now, one of the reasons thank you for the answer. One of the reasons this book is very timely right now, or in particular, your argument about how journalists work not only for their employer but for social media platforms, is because of what has been in the news and has just recently been legislated, the News Media Bargaining Code. Can you speak a little bit about how you think your book helps us understand that code, and also maybe some of your thoughts on how it's been executed and whether you think this is a win for journalists?
Yeah, certainly. So I just published a shorter piece in Jacobin magazine, and I had this kind of debate with the local editor who, for very understandable reasons, basically saw the bargaining code as garbage, as something that was just there to fund Murdoch and Kerry, the big media companies in Australia. But I wanted to argue something a little bit more nuanced, I think. And I think hopefully what my book can help us understand about this is the kind of labour relations that underlie some of the concerns that are expressed through the media bargaining code, though in a kind of changed way, and also some of the limitations as well. I think it's correct to have some strong criticisms of how it's been produced, but the impetus behind the bill that was supported by across the board, there was pretty unanimous support for it in the Senate, was that it recognises the contribution that news companies, or particularly journalists, I think is the argument that I'd rather make to social media platforms and to search engines as well. So it recognises the fact that the content is being produced, journalists are circulating it, they are engaging with social media audiences in a way that is profitable for those platforms, and that this work has not been compensated up until now. Right? So I think it's important to recognise that. But at the same time, I think the way that this bargaining code has, at least seems to be implemented at this point, is that the promises that this funding would go to, that smaller news organisations would be able to collectively bargain when they went to the table with platforms, seems to have gone by the wayside, whereas the government has decided that they're just satiated with paying off the big media companies. So that's the one big issue, but there's another big issue there as well, and that's that there's no real guarantees that the money, that the revenue that these news organisations get is going to make its way to newsrooms and is going to actually better resource journalism and provide opportunities for more diverse journalists to get into the field, or to pay them better as well. So I think the fight needs to be the fight for journalists and by the MEAA, the union that represents journalists in this country, needs to be to put some guarantees in place that this bill will support journalists and better fund them into the future.
Great. We're at 4:33, and so I think I actually have two more questions, but I'm going to open up to everyone that's here. We have a fairly big group, so if you could either use the raise hand button or say in chat that you have a question, and I'll call on you. Actually, I don't have the hosting privileges, so probably if you have a question, just type it in chat and we'll call on you. You can just type, I have a question.
Margie, if I could just say at this point that this this afternoon is being recorded. So just to let you know that. And Margie, I'll keep an eye on the chat for you as
okay, great. Thank you. So I'll ask I'll keep asking questions. Another thing that I found really fascinating, Tai, was around your work on thinking about how content management systems structure both labor practices and new expectations about what can be produced. And again, much like the question I asked about the social media editors as change agents, but also shaping the kinds of stories themselves. Do you want to talk a little bit about how technology has changed news practice and its artifacts?
Yeah, thanks, Margie. It just reminds me as well that Chris read this chapter, so thanks, Chris, for reading it. And there's a bunch of people here, Steve and others, who read chapters for me as well. So I wanted to kind of thank them for the work that they put into the book as well. I think Chris's favorite term in the chapter was sausage factory, which I don't think was intended to be gendered, but basically several New Zealand journalists talked about their role as feeling like a factory or like a sausage factory. So one in particular was a layout editor, and he told me about the ways that each day he came into the office, and they work in shifts there. So somebody basically left the workstation and then he logged in, and that all his work would already be lined up for him. So there would already be a story there that he would start to kind of copy and layout edit. And then as soon as it was done, the next one was lined up and kind of appeared for him to produce the new one. And so he was doing this work. A lot of it was outsourced work from, so he's in New Zealand in a small hub, but a lot of it was from Australian local newspapers as well. So he just had this never-ending process of editing content. But some people in more reporting roles also talked about the CMS as this sausage factory as well, where they felt like they basically just inputted data, their story, into a set of boxes. So they also talked about it in terms of writing into the box, and that included more traditional things, the reporting itself, but also things like writing a headline that in the past was the role of a sub-editor, at least in New Zealand. Putting in the metadata, doing a separate headline for SEO and potentially for social media as well, adding their images, and then hitting the proofs button, and this would kind of produce a standardized format for this story. So there were ways that this process shaped what was written, but also mostly how it would be formatted and what the process of getting from coming up with the story to writing it and to publishing it would be.
Great. I have to say, I always liked the kind of editorial flow of working with a content management system, but I always worked in magazines. So there's a different kind of time pressure. So I would really be interested to know if there's a difference between how a newsroom experiences the same content management system as a monthly or a weekly, because a weekly was definitely a much more intense thing to experience. So it just struck me. I mean, I quite liked this has been assigned to you, now it's my job, but maybe I was just a young, eager reporter. Okay, great. Joanne Faulkner has a question. Joanne, do you want to turn your microphone on?
Thanks, Margie. Yeah, Tai, it sounds so interesting and important as well. It's great you've done this work. I think you kind of touched a little on my question just then, but I was intrigued by when you said that the journalists you spoke to kind of tried to construe their work intensification as not really work, and you know, that bleed between their kind of personal and professional that comes through this engagement through social media. And what I was wondering was, were there expressions, I guess, of dissatisfaction about work intensification? Were there expressions of nostalgia about the way in which things used to be, or were the journalists you were looking to perhaps a new generation who, I guess, didn't have the experience of previous modes of work? Thanks.
Cool, thanks, Joe. Yeah, so it was definitely a strong discourse, this idea that you shouldn't consider these new types of tasks or the tasks that take place outside of traditional work hours as work. And it gets me into this kind of difficult relationship that you sometimes have with interviews and interviewees, where they're really experts in what they do, and they give me amazing accounts talking about the ways that, so one journalist gave me this account of how he was always chasing the news cycle, always trying to find the next story, produce it, tick the boxes, I think he said, and then send it out. And then he said he wouldn't even have a time for a cup of tea afterwards to think about, you know, the great work that he'd done. He was on to the next thing. But for him, he saw this as a kind of sink or swim situation, that you've got to do this. Otherwise, you are infinitely replaceable. But it's not just the pressure. He also was really proud of the work that he produced, and got to take your hat off to these journalists who are doing excellent work under really difficult circumstances or really intense circumstances, and they don't do it for the money or the hours which have been eroding over time. They do it because of their passion for the work, and also that as journalists are also a type of creative that have a type of autonomy over the types of stories that they produce and how they produce them as well. That's not totally foreclosed to. So there's an interesting tension there that you put your finger on, and it's sort of unpacking those different elements. Yeah.
Great. Bridget has a question as well.
Thanks, Tai. This does follow on from Joe's question to some extent. The whole issue of work intensification and labour practices and serving in good part the needs or expectations of one's employer. Was there what sort of gendered aspect to this did you find in the interviews? Were roughly half of your interviewees female, and did some women workers express more concern about the expectations to be constantly updating, given the sort of their domestic family circumstances?
Yeah, thanks, Bridget. I just noticed Joe in the chat mentioned as well that there's a lot of similarities here to academic work, and I think that's for certain. Often it felt like I was almost writing some of the stories felt autobiographical, even though they were coming out of somebody else's mouth. That gender dimension is really important. So it's the journalist that I spoke about later who had that excellent description, talking about being an updater rather than a reporter, was a woman journalist who had really gone up the ranks at a smaller newspaper, and then had left the profession briefly when she had children, which I think is a common experience for a lot of women who are not given the resources to be able to manage an intensive workload, managerial responsibilities, as well as domestic responsibilities as well. and she had done kind of freelance work before coming back in a part-time position. And so for her, it was the concern that a part-time position was basically part-time pay for a full-time job, and some as well being required to produce on a shift 5 news stories. So that was a big concern. But I think those gender dimensions also reflected in discussions of journalist relationships to social media as well. So a lot of the journalists, the women journalists who spoke to me, discussed. I asked questions of all of the journalists about what their experience of social media was like, and a lot of the women said that it was mostly negative. Often they said, "Oh yeah, my female colleagues often have been trolled and have been in some really bad situations," and then they would think of, after kind of recounting one of their colleagues' stories, they would say, "Oh, actually, I've been trolled as well," and they'll give me a story where they had faced types of issues that they said most of their male colleagues didn't face. So I think it shows that the risks of this type of entrepreneurial journalism, this kind of self-promotion that's required of journalists in social media spaces, are really unevenly distributed. So women and journalists from minorities are far more likely to face types of harassment, and it's workplace harassment, and it should be treated like that by employers. And some journalists also spoke to me about, if you're a journalist who writes about race or writes about women's issues, then even if you are a white dude or their Asian male colleagues would face trolling just because of the types of stories that they were writing as well.
And that is a timely discussion as well. There is some discussion about protection for journalists going on in the UK right now around that kind of harassment that they're subjected to. All right, the next question is from Helen. Helen.
Thank you, Margie. Tai, such interesting work, and kind of, there's a lot of crossover in my stuff around representations of self and identity, professional identities, journalism, broadcast professional identities. Literally use the word sausage factory in my tutorial this morning. You'll be pleased to hear I'm always a little bit careful about using that word with students, but it did come out. I'm wondering, kind of linking in with the stuff around gender, but also then status and rights of refusal. I know from my research, depending upon the status and the gender and profile of the journalist, people were often in a position to refuse work, or this kind of became a bit of a badge of honour that said, they can because that online space isn't, the jurisdiction of that is unclear in terms of navigating the workload, that people would, some cases in my work, would say, I'm just not going to do it. That might be what they say that I need to do, and I'm not going to play the game, kind of thing. But typically they were people who already had high profiles and were high status and effectively had other mechanisms of the institution working to support them in that space, so they didn't have to do a lot of that work directly. Did you find any correlations with that?
Yeah, definitely. They're reflected along hierarchies within the news organisation and gendered lines as well. So there are, in New Zealand and in the US, and I just saw a study, it's a longitudinal study in Australia, there are now a majority of journalists are women, but they are by far a minority when it comes to the higher up editorial or managerial roles as well. And I had great interviews with mostly men who were in those managerial positions, who were able to talk me through the longue durée of their careers as they shifted from analog to digital media and what that meant for them. But you're right that so many of them were shielded and are shielded from many of the responsibilities of social media. So when they talked about the requirement to have a set of digital skills, or the requirement to engage through social media. For them, that was more it was a task of doling that out to the journalists below them, scheduling posts, scheduling journalists to engage through their stories, or making sure that they had the training to do so. Whereas themselves, they more had kind of funny anecdotes about finding a good story online or something like that. That was that was their experience of social media.
All right. So we've got Linda and then Wes, and then I think we've run out of time for questions, but we can have some more informal discussion afterwards. So Linda, you have a question.
Yeah, it was interesting actually. I was just listening to Helen. Hers, your both sort of your work sort of reflects mine. I'm talking a lot about in terms of hope labour and the industrial agency of precariat journalists at that level. I use the term. I was using the term battery hen as opposed to sausage factory, but a similar thing. I noticed you were talking about the digital organisations becoming heavily unionised in the US. Some of the new startups, particularly, and I was just interested whether there was some tension there between the concept of a unionised workplace and the work conditions of it's not work if it's the work that you do outside of work is not work. How were those tensions handled? Because I'm particularly sort of interested in the industrial element to that and the tension between the sort of being a unionised workplace and yet still having that perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. I use the term hope labour as well. I think that's a really productive way to think through some of these promotional activities. So I think the way that those tensions have been managed is through some quite different contracts that have emerged, that have been voted on in some of those organisations. So I think one of the big conflicts that I'm most familiar with is the kind of ideology or the idea that some of these digital first media companies have about not really being a news company or a media company, but being a tech company. And that what this requires is to be kind of infinitely flexible about who you hire and fire and what their roles are as well. And I think some of the contracts reflect a negotiation with those kind of creative industries type approaches. So some of them didn't include a fire with cause clause in the US. This is going to, if you don't know too much about the US labor relations, it might be shocking that most people sign contracts in the US where they don't need a reason to be fired. They're hired at will, but in union contracts, usually they put some restrictions on that. That's been the traditional way that unions often help reporters, or help workers. But in some of these newsrooms, they have not included those clauses. And so journalists have told me, and I've also read in a few other interview accounts, that they still felt like the companies that they worked for needed to be able to be flexible with their hiring and firing processes, and so they opted not to have a cause clause in the contract. So that's, I think, I don't know, from a labour standards perspective, that's a bit scary, and also from an editorial independence position, that's quite scary, because it means that it puts reporters who might report on, say, the company that they work for, or they might report stories that go against the beliefs of their CEOs. It puts them at risk at potentially being fired, so they are less independent. because of that. But there are other good clauses that I've seen put into these contracts as well. So there are some that focus on editorial autonomy, and there are many that have put in really specific language about diversity as well, and making sure that the hiring decisions at these organizations are in line with kind of the ethos that they have about having a diverse set of journalists that are able to write from different perspectives and address different communities. Cool. Thanks, Linda.
Right. Our last question is from Wes.
Hey, Tai. I guess just really quickly, kind of basic question, if you think the various trends that you've seen and things you've been talking about are going to kind of continue in the direction that they are, I guess the sausage factory-esque direction, or is this kind of a flash in the pan as people adjust to technology, or do you think there'll be kind of internal backlash to this? What way do you see these kinds of things? Like, will these same stories, do you think, be repeating in 5 or 10 years, or will we see something completely different?
Yeah, thanks, Wiz. Yeah, I guess that's a hard one. I think many of the issues that I wanted to address when I was starting out in this area, when I started to see the strike against Huffington Post, have become more and more entrenched. So that tells me that some of these issues continue to be important and are likely to continue on into the near future at least. But then there are all sorts of changes that we're seeing at the moment as well. So actually a lot of the digital news companies have closed down in recent years. We've seen a retraction of some of the local versions of international news organizations as well, due to economic pressures. So there's some of the organizations that did unionize are now no longer, or have very emaciated newsrooms. So there's those kind of concerns, and there's also different types of platforms that are emerging as well. So I think there are really important potentials to research things like Patreon and Medium, these platforms where journalists are writing in a kind of a patron style, right? So they're asking for members' subscriptions or individual donations to support their work. So there are, I think, some of the same issues around precarity, around the economic turmoil, some of the cultural changes are all still underlying these, but then there are different manifestations that we need to continue to look into as well. Cheers.